it's not a question of starving. It's a question of not being able to lead a productive life, not being able to lead a full life. So you just don't have enough in terms of quantity and quality of food to be able to lead a full life. That's the more general way in which one thinks about hunger. One thinks about hunger in terms of undernourishment, malnutrition, etc. And one thinks about hunger nowadays also in terms of hidden hunger. You may have enough to eat, but you're eating the wrong types of food, or you're not getting adequate amounts of quality in your food, nutritional quality, vitamins, minerals, protein, etc. So you may not be hungry in a calorie sense of the word, but you don't have the quality of diet that allows you to be healthy. So that's also a manifestation of hunger in a way. And most people don't think about this, but when I think about hunger and malnutrition, I also include obesity in this. Because obesity can result from poor diet, from not eating good quality food and eating high energy dense, high calorie dense food. And that's also a form of malnourishment. And to me, understanding why people are undernourished and why people are overnourished is part of the same set of issues around hunger and around food and food security. And so that I bring these all together in my talk today. Let me start by saying, if you think about India, and if you reflect back over time, if you reflect back over the last 60, 70 years, we've made enormous progress in addressing the acute hunger problem and addressing the problems of famines and mass starvation. Here's a slide which shows you the history of famines globally since about the 1860s onwards. And if you look at this history of famines, it becomes quite clear that from about the 1960s and 1970s, the incidence of famines have dropped dramatically. And we as a global community have actually managed to make famines history. And that's something I don't think we celebrate enough. When was the last time we saw a famine in India? The last time we saw famine in India would have been in the late 60s, early 1970s. Since then, we haven't seen a famine. Of course, we have hungry people. We have people who don't have access to enough food, but it's not famine in the traditional large-scale starvation sense. Even in Africa, the only places where we're seeing large-scale famine today are areas where conflict is happening, where wars are happening. But even in Africa, we've seen this tremendous change that's taken place in addressing acute hunger. And I think that's a really important point that we as a community need to appreciate and ask, how did we do it? India itself has seen that dramatic change. If you look at what happened in terms of food imports into India and food exports, up until the 1990s, India was a net importer of food. India was massively food deficit in the 60s and the 70s. And it was a major importer, not just in cash terms, but also in terms of food aid. Wheat and rice were major imports. But since the 1990s, India turned around and India has become a major exporter of food, exporter of rice. It's among the top 5 rice exporting countries in the world, and a small exporter of wheat. And recently, during the Ukraine crisis, there was talk about India feeding the rest of the world. That it's a bit premature, but the potential for India being a sustained exporter of food is something that one can anticipate as we look ahead. That's a big change. That's been a tremendous change that's happened. And it's happened because of India's investment in its agriculture sector, that investments that took place after independence and really geared up in the 1960s, 70s, onwards since then. And that then changed the dynamics in India. It allowed India to go from a situation of being desperately poor and desperately hungry to a country that became self-sufficient in food and then became a major exporter and managed the acute hunger problems and managed the calorie hunger issues that the country has been facing. And one way to look at the achievement in terms of food security in India is to look at how food availability, staple grain availability, rice, wheat, and maize, has more than kept up with the growth in population. So over time, even as populations were rising, you saw that per capita availability of staple grains kept up with the growth in population and then also outpaced. In the 1960s, there was this very famous book called The Population Bomb, which was written by a Stanford professor, Paul Ehrlich. And in that book, Paul Ehrlich argued that India would never be able to feed itself, and that India will not be able to sustain itself as a country because of rapid growth in population and not having food resources to be able to sustain that population. And he made the same argument about China, the same argument about Bangladesh and about Indonesia. But what happened? We very quickly proved Paul Ehrlich wrong. We very quickly showed that India, China, Indonesia, Bangladesh not only could feed themselves, but they became major emerging economies of Asia. And it started with agriculture and investments in agriculture. And that's something that in my class at Cornell, I talk about quite a bit, and I provide lots of data on this to show that as time went on, as countries in Asia, India in particular, which was predominantly agriculture, predominantly rural in the 60s and 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s, transformed itself to becoming a more urban, more industrial, more service sector economy. And the movement of population from rural areas, rural employment to urban employment happened over this time period. But this change would not have happened if you did not first start with investments in increasing agriculture productivity. Because as agriculture productivity increased, that increased productivity resulted in increased incomes for small farms. And that increased income resulted in investments in schooling, in better housing, in getting goods from outside the agriculture sector. And that triggered the growth, that kickstarted the overall growth. People like myself, coming from a small village in Krishna district in Andhra Pradesh, were able to go through schooling and college with the the income that came from the Green Revolution, with increased income that came from increased productivity of rice that was grown on our farm. And that story is true for several of you in this audience. And that story is true for millions of young people in the 60s and 70s and 80s that transformed from a rural upbringing to becoming more urban-based individuals and families. And investments that took place in cities such as Hyderabad, etc. And what I'm always amazed about is the way in which India, China, and several other countries in Asia transform themselves into global economies, into major global emerging economies. Imagine in the 1970s, if someone told you that by 2020, India would be among the top 10 economies in the world in terms of the size of its GDP, you wouldn't have believed it. You would have said, no way. But that's what happened. And the trigger for that has been the very early investments that took place in rural India, and how rural India then led to the overall transformation. That's the same thing that we see across the board. It's the same story that we see for China, for Indonesia, and we're seeing now for Bangladesh. And now more recently, you're beginning to see some of that in some countries in sub-Saharan Africa also. So what happened? How did India manage to become food self-sufficient? I think there's several reasons for it. The first is the massive investments that India made in agriculture research and development. In the 60s and in the 70s, India invested in improved varieties of rice, improved varieties of wheat, corn, etc. And much of these technologies started in international agriculture research centers. The International Center for Rice in the Philippines, the International Center for Wheat and Maize in Mexico. The varieties, the improved varieties from these centers were brought into India. I was fortunate to have had the opportunity to work in both of these centers. And these varieties transformed the productivity of rice, wheat, and maize. In the 1960s, you were lucky if you got 1 ton per hectare yield for a rice crop. But with these varieties coming in, the yields went from a ton and a half, to 3.5, 4 tons per hectare per crop of rice, for a crop of wheat, etc. It was a tripling, quadrupling of yields that took place. That tremendous jump in productivity then created a big boost in incomes for farm households. So that was one big issue. The second was investments in irrigation. During colonial times, there were lots of canal irrigation investments that took place in Punjab, Haryana areas, etc. And certainly the Green Revolution started there because that irrigation investments were already in place. But then independent India invested in irrigation in several other parts, in the river deltas in the south, the Krishna Delta, the Godavari Delta, the Kaveri Delta, etc. So you suddenly had irrigation investments that created a rice bowl around the coastal areas of southern India, along with investments in the Indo-Gangetic. But more recently, there's been investments in small-scale irrigation, pump irrigation systems, which have also expanded the overall area. In addition to irrigation, road infrastructure, transport infrastructure, market infrastructure were big parts of the changes that took place also. Now, some would have argued that because of population growth and because of rural population being so dense, and given that farms are so small, that over time, you would not be able to sustain forest land and other lands. And basically, all of the available area would be moved into agriculture. But it turned out that the total land area under cultivation has remained relatively the same between 1960 and today. But the total amount of agriculture production quadrupled in this time period. How did that happen? It happened because of increased intensification. It happened because you were able to grow a second crop and sometimes a third crop on the same piece of land. And that change happened because the varieties that were grown were much shorter in the amount of time needed for them to produce grain and to be harvested. So you went from 120, 130 days to less than 100 days for a crop, duration of the crop. And second, because of irrigation investments, you could produce a crop in the dry season. And that investment, along with fertilizers and other inputs, allowed you to intensify production. And therefore, you could actually see substantial productivity improvements, supply improvement, and at the same time, see a renewal of forest area and reforestation coming in to the country. And that was a change that was never expected, but that was a change that happened. So when I think about the Green Revolution, and I write quite a bit about this, I think about it in terms of the 4 I's that made India successful in improving its food supply. Innovations in agriculture technology, infrastructure investments, irrigation, power, roads, etc. Institutional reforms, land rights, land tenancy laws, access to credit, etc. Incentives for increasing productivity, so price policies, the minimum support price had a big role to play. The procurement policies had a big role to play. Input subsidies, etc. So these 4 I's coming together played a major role in improving food supplies and food security in the country. But it wasn't all success. What hasn't worked? Well, what hasn't worked is that there were significant differences across the country. So Punjab, Haryana, the western part of the Indo-Gangetic Plains were all very successful in increasing overall agriculture productivities, increasing incomes, etc. The southern coastal delta areas were very successful. But Eastern India and the central part of India continued to stagnate. They continued to be low productive in terms of rice and wheat and coarse cereals, etc. Central India was in the dryland areas, were extremely poor. But more recently, you've seen a change and a transformation there also. Central India has become a major belt for cotton and oilseed production, soybean production. And that has created the same transformation in Maharashtra, all the way, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, going up to Gujarat, through this oil and cotton revolution that's happened. The same sort of transformation that we're seeing there as we've seen with rice and wheat in some of the traditional green revolution areas. So that interregional difference continues to be there. Eastern India in particular continues to lag behind, both in terms of productivity, but also in terms of poverty and nutrition. The second change I think we've seen is that in the 60s and 70s, the crops that were grown in the different parts of the country were much more diverse. You had large areas under pulses, the dals, which are so essential in India, in the Indian diet, and coarse cereals, sorghum and millets, bajra, ragi, jawar, etc. And from these maps, you can see that both the areas under pulses and the areas under coarse cereals dropped quite significantly. And you can see that more clearly here. You can see that over time, while the area under rice and wheat were rising, the area under pulses, sorghum, millets, etc., declined and declined quite significantly. Now, today you're in a situation where the demand for pulses is skyrocketing, and the demand for millets is increasing because of increased health consciousness, especially among urban populations. So I see an opportunity here for a renaissance in these crops and a revival in this investments here. And that's where ICRISAT as an institution can play a big role in bringing new technologies and a new emphasis for some of these crops, these forgotten orphan crops in a way, but create a new way in which you can enhance productivity. But that wasn't, the Green Revolution kind of inadvertently pushed these crops out to the mainstream. And now it's time to bring them back in. So let's talk about hunger now. So when I talk about hunger in this context, I'm no longer talking about famines and starvation. I'm talking about not having an adequate amount of food. And in this graph, an adequate amount of calorie consumption. So when the UN thinks about adequate calorie consumption per person per day, the usual metric is around 1800 to 1850 kilocalories per person per day. So if you take that as your cutoff, then even today, around 15% of Indian population doesn't get to that 1800 or 1850 cutoff in terms of calorie consumption. And therefore one considers around 150 million people in India to be hungry. But then the question is, what's the depth of that hunger? So it turns out that the difference between that 1800 cutoff to where the population is quite small. So today, that depth has dropped in the last 20 years, last 30 years. It's dropped from around 160 calories to close to 100 calories. So a normal diet, if you have a lunch or breakfast, you'd be eating around 500 calories or so. So this is less than a meal. So the gap is small, but given that the population that's affected by hunger is so large, it's a big challenge that we need to be addressing. So the calorie hunger challenge continues to be there. But I think it's a question of, it's not a question of not having enough supply of food, but it's a question of getting food to the poorest and the ones for whom food is least accessible. The government's PDS programs and the midday meal programs are doing quite a lot in this area. But there's a lot more that can be done to improve the effectiveness, to improve the targeting, etc. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But that's about calorie hunger. And that's what we call undernourishment, when we think about people not having adequate calories to meet that 1800 or 1850 benchmark. But the other part of the hunger story is what we call hidden hunger. Hidden hunger is when you're meeting the calorie requirement, but you're not having adequate amounts of nutrients in your diet, adequate amounts of vitamins, minerals, proteins, etc., and micronutrients, iron, zinc, etc. And when you don't have the micronutrients and the other nutrients adequately, then that manifests in terms of poor health for children, poor health for adults. And it's particularly severe as you look at women and children. So let's look at some data. So if you look at what's happening to malnourishment trends, malnourishment trends for children, the way one would measure this is to look at child stunting, underweight, and child wasting. And India has been very fortunate that there's a long-term national survey that's done every 5 years. The last one was just finished in 2021, where they look at the health and the diets of populations across the country. It's called the National Family Health Survey. And using that data, one can track what's been happening to health of different populations. And if you look at child stunting, between the early 1990 to the most recent period, we see that there's been significant improvement in child stunting. You've come down quite a bit from around 52% of children being stunted to today about 35%. That's a big change, but I don't think it's good enough. I don't think it's good enough because we still have a third of the children in India under 5 who are stunted. Stunted meaning they don't have the height that's required for a particular age. So they're much shorter than the age group standards are. Similarly, they're underweight relative to that age. And the weight to height ratio is much lower than it ought to be. And so there's a lot more progress that needs to be made here. But the issue of stunting is not a question of meeting the calorie requirement. The issue of stunting happens because you don't have adequate amounts of protein and micronutrients in the diet. So the diet quality is not good enough. So access to vegetables, fruit, dairy products, etc., is very limited. And when it's limited for children under 5, that manifests itself in terms of stunting, underweight, and wasting. And if children are stunted when they're under 5, then it's not reversible, or it's very difficult to reverse it. So that becomes a really big standard for looking at child malnutrition. But again, the problem of child malnutrition is not the same across the whole country. So you find the more progressive parts of the country, the southern Indian states and districts, Northwest India, have much lower levels of child malnutrition compared to Central India and to Eastern India. And these are also the areas with high levels of poverty, high levels of food insecurity in general, and low levels of agriculture productivity. So there's a lot of work to be done there. We need to be looking at how do we change that situation. The second manifestation of malnutrition among adults is to look at anemia, iron deficient anemia. And if you look at women and effects of anemia on women, it's extremely high. And anemia levels, again, when you look at the eastern parts of the country and the central part of the country, are significantly higher than other parts of India. And there could be many reasons for the incidence of anemia, including poor sanitation, poor public health facilities, etc. But one of the drivers of anemia is diet quality, not having adequate iron-rich food in the diet. And that's a major problem. And improving access to vegetables, especially green leafy vegetables, access to dairy products, etc., can change the anemia situation quite significantly in the country. Then I mentioned obesity. This is a big story, and it's not been recognized enough in India. When you think about malnutrition, I put obesity in the malnutrition category because I see poor diets, high calorie and high energy dense diets as a big contributor to obesity, along with lack of exercise, lifestyle changes, etc. And the same data that looked at child stunting also looks at adult health and adult obesity, cardiovascular disease incidence, diabetes, etc. And you find that over time, the incidence of obesity, incidence of non-communicable diseases, etc., among adults, both men and women, has been rising, and rising quite significantly in the country. It's becoming a major public health challenge. And so we need, even while we're thinking about food insecurity and hunger, we should be looking at the issues around obesity. And to me, the answer to both sides of that equation is better access to more affordable, nutritious food, better access to affordable vegetables, fruit, meat, milk, etc. And the obesity issues, again, are very regional in nature. So it's a mirror image of the undernutrition issues. So the parts of the country that have progressed a lot are also the parts of the country where obesity levels are also rising the highest. So Southern India, Northwest India are areas where you see much higher levels of obesity compared to the other parts of the country. So we're in this curious situation We're seeing progress on the undernourishment, but we're seeing increases in the overnourishment side of the story. And that's something we should be trying to address as we look ahead. So what are some of the emerging concerns that we should be thinking about as we look ahead? As we look ahead, I think the issue for us is, as incomes are rising, especially among the poorer populations, overall demand for food is rising. But it's not just any food. The demand for non-starchy food is rising. So it's the demand for rice and wheat tends to stabilize, but the demand for other foods tends to increase. So the demand for fruits, vegetables, dairy products, meat, fats, sugars, etc., tends to increase. But when you look at the actual data on consumption, you begin to see that the big rise that you're seeing among the populations as incomes are rising in general is the rise in high energy food consumption, the rise in fatty food, fats, oils, sugars, etc., rising relative to the more nutritious food. That's where the trigger to obesity is happening. And that rise in high energy food is coming through traditional sources, but it's also coming through increased consumption of processed foods. So if you look at packaged and processed food consumption, that's been rising quite dramatically over time, and it'll continue to rise. And one of the reasons why it'll continue to rise is because it's so much cheaper than fresh food, and it's so less in terms of time intensity for cooking and for consumption, etc. So think Maggi noodles, for example. They meet, they're easy to make and they meet an immediate need. And so you find that type of processed food consumption rising even in rural communities. And the modern grocery retail chains, which is rising, as we all know, hasn't been successful in bringing fresh food in as much as it ought to. So today, for fresh vegetables, you still go to the street market rather than to the grocery store. And unless you bring that bridge, what happens is the modern groceries become a major conduit for processed and packaged foods and not a major supplier of fresh food. And that's a bridge that needs to be addressed, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The other thing that we've seen is that, especially with COVID, there's been a lot more online food deliveries. There's been a lot more e-commerce and food, etc. in India. The question is, will that help address this balance of bringing fresh food, cooked food, rather than processed foods to consumers? And we don't have the answer to that. But my presumption is that you're still going to see a large amount of high energy, high sugar dense foods coming in rather than more nutritious foods through the system. So we are now in this quandary. We're saying, how do we increase the supply of more nutritious food? And how do you make it more affordable? So today, if you look at the situation, you find that more nutritious foods, vegetables, fruit, pulses, etc., have much higher prices compared to staples like rice and wheat. Rice and wheat have been much more stable relative to these other food groups. And so affordability is a major challenge. So in my team, we actually looked at affordability of what's known as a recommended diet. So the Lancet is a major medical journal, which provided guidance on, this is an appropriate diet for a healthy individual. The National Institute of Nutrition, which is in Hyderabad, has also come up with a recommended diet for Indian populations. What my team did was to say, okay, what are people eating today in rural India? And in rural India, looking at these various food groups, we said, okay, let's take the cheapest of each of the food groups. And we calculated the diet, and it works out to around 50 cents. Sorry, I did it in US currency because we were presenting to a US audience. Now, if the same households use the recommended diet, it comes to around $3.50. So it comes to 3 times as much or more if you want to get to a recommended diet. And that's an enormous jump. It's a big jump because the supply of the more nutritious foods is not at the stage at which you can bring the prices down and to make that more affordable. And if you think about malnutrition in India today, we have to come back to the roots on saying, how do we make the supply system, the agriculture system, responsive to this changing diets? And how do we enhance the supply of these more nutritious foods? So that's what I'd like to talk about now. I know I'm going to run a bit over time, but let me run through that. So what's the way forward? How do we get to moving from food quantity to food quality and affordability? That's the big challenge that I think the government and the entire community needs to be addressing. So in my view, we need to go back to the basics. We need to go back to saying, let's enhance productivity of small farm agriculture. But when we think about enhancing productivity this time, the emphasis ought to be much more on looking beyond the big 3 staples, looking beyond rice, wheat, and maize, looking at coarse cereals, millet, sorghum, etc., looking at pulses, looking at vegetables, livestock products, etc. That's where the emphasis has to be. So it has to be a complete change in priorities in the agriculture sector, in agriculture research. And in addition to that, looking at ways in which you can get these technologies out to small farms. So ICTs, big data systems, etc., will play a big role, I think, as we look ahead in terms of not just developing the technologies, but getting them to farmers' fields and improving access for small farms. That's going to be a big challenge, but I think that's where we need to be looking at. Second, urban consumers' demand for diversity of food is increasing quite dramatically. Fruits, vegetables, dairy product demand, etc., is rising. But the supply hasn't kept up, as we've talked about. So vegetable prices go through the roof, especially in the dry season. And they're not well connected to the supermarket value chains. So and small farms are not well connected to these markets, because for small farmers, getting access to the technology is one thing, but also getting connected to the value chain, the supermarket value chain, is a big problem. So how do you reduce that? How do you connect them? How do you reduce the transactions cost for small farms? One of the ways we argue about this is to create farmer producer organizations, to create aggregation of small farms so that they can work together and be able to bargain better because of their size as you form a group with the value chains, with the supermarket chains, etc., and bridge that gap between the rising demand and the poor supply of fresh food, perishable food into urban centers. If you can do that, then you create new opportunities for growth. You create new opportunities for growth for small farms, especially in areas which are being left behind today. And you'll see similar type of growth happening in Central India or Eastern India that you've seen in other parts of the world if you can create those value chains that go beyond the big staples. Then the other issue is the safety net programs in India. I think the public distribution system for rice and wheat has helped enormously in reducing calorie hunger. But looking ahead, we need to say the public distribution systems, the midday meal schemes for schools should look beyond rice and wheat. They should be looking at ways to incorporate more nutritious food into the system, bringing in pulses, vegetables, etc., coarse cereals, and to move the procurement system, which is now very much focused on high producing areas and bringing food into low producing areas, to look at more local procurement systems, local or state level procurement of food. And that way you generate more production within the state, within the locality, rather than bringing food from the outside. And look at ways in which you can get beyond food-based systems to look at other cash-based systems, etc. And that's an area that we've been doing some work on, looking at different alternatives, etc. And just to make one final point here, when we think about nutrition and malnutrition, a lot of what I've talked about is related to food and related to productivity. So productivity then leads to increased incomes and increased supply and reduced prices, and the public distribution systems, etc., bring in more access. But you also need to look at what's happening at the household level and improve behavior at the household level. You need to look at ways in which women and girls have equal access to food, both in quantity terms and quality terms. And that intra-household behavior change is a big part of addressing the malnutrition problem. Women's empowerment, as was mentioned earlier today, is a big part of the story for addressing malnutrition. And finally, nutrient absorption. You can eat as much as you want, but your body may not be able to absorb the nutrients if you don't have access to clean drinking water, you don't have access to sanitation facilities, you don't have good public health infrastructure, etc. So water, sanitation, hygiene are also important parts when you think about the whole malnutrition paradigm. So all of these come together. And food is important, but so is all the other aspects, all the other dimensions. I was going to conclude with a set of policy lessons, but I see that I'm running out of time. But I've sort of emphasized many of these again and again throughout the talk. We've made tremendous progress, but we have a long way to go. We need to look beyond the big staples. We need to look at diversity in the food system. both from the production side and from the consumption side. And we need to look at a way in which we can rejuvenate smallholder agriculture and connect it better to urban demands and urban food value chains. That'll create the new growth opportunities, I think. Let me stop here, Subha. I know I've taken more time than you asked me to. Let me just do one more thing. Here's information on our programs. And a lot of our work is on our website. And all of the work we do on India is on our website. We also have lots of data on our website. So please feel welcome to visit our site if you want more information. And we're very active on social media, and you're welcome to follow us on social media. So with that, I'll say thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you, Prabhu. Let me...
I'll stop share.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that was quite a lot of information to absorb, not just about hunger, starting with the definition of hunger, actually. In fact, there are a lot of questions. I'll take some of them as we go along in the next about 20 minutes so that we can end around 8 o'clock. One of our members was saying that, is it a misnomer to say, how can we get India to be hunger free? Because like you said in the early part of the presentation, there are no more famines. It's only can we just talk about it as undernourished, or we are not at the desired levels of nourishment? So is the title a misnomer in that sense? He was wondering.
Definitely, the answer can be yes. But if I go around and say undernourishment, nobody will understand me. Right. Especially the policy community. Right. So if hunger is something that resonates better. So when you talk to the Ministry of Agriculture or the Finance Ministry, hunger is an issue that's a policy issue. When you say undernourishment, then most people don't understand exactly what that means. Mm-hmm. And then, as I said, it's so complex. So people say malnourishment, malnutrition, and these are all synonymous. But purely from getting people to resonate to the problem and identify with the problem, hunger is the word that tends to be used, especially among the policy community, but also the donor community.
I see. Mm-hmm.
So that's why hunger is the word. But as I mentioned in the talk, it's a very nuanced word. It's very complex.
Right. You've actually laid out a very detailed and vivid picture of how the world, humanity itself, has come out of the situation of constant famines to, including Africa, there are no real hunger deaths, so to say. Productivity has increased, and you laid out the various reasons, whether it's infrastructure, irrigation, access, technology, so on, research institutions which have played a role in the green revolution, increase in food availability throughout the world. One question remains, especially in the context of India. When things have improved all around in this food ecosystem, why is the farmer still distressed to the point of committing suicide? And it's a big issue in India. So has the personal economic benefit of the farmer not kept pace with the other attributes of improving food productivity and availability? And what are your thoughts on that? Is that a part of any of the study or work that your institute is doing?
So first, let me say, there is still, hunger is still an issue, but my earlier point was famines as we've known them are no longer an issue, I think.
Mhm.
So famines have become history, but people do get hungry. You still have people dying of hunger, much smaller numbers, but not at the level of a famine. It's much more an individual issue rather than a community level or region level issue. So that's, I think, is the difference. I think, you know, a very common word that I hear when I'm in India, in rural India, is farmer distress. And people use the word farmer distress to mean a lot of different things. And I think one of the reasons why this issue comes up is because there's big transition that's happening. You see that India is moving much more out of the agriculture sector into the non-agriculture sector. The share of agriculture in GDP has dropped significantly. So the attention that was given to the agriculture sector in the past is no longer being given to that extent. And so support services and roads and transport and public health infrastructure, etc., haven't been put in place as much as they should be. So living standards of rural India have become very different from living standards of urban India, even for the poor.
Mhm.
That's creating part of the distress that you see. The second is because of poor market infrastructure and because of poor contractual arrangements, etc., farmers haven't been able to take advantage of the growth and demand for food in urban areas as much as they could have taken advantage of. So if you had better contractual farming arrangements, better legislation or regulation around contracts, etc., that would have created a much better system, a streamlined system for connecting small farms to markets. And that doesn't exist. So there are, in that context, there are opportunities for farmers being taken advantage of and cheating, etc. That happens. And much of the issues around farmer suicides are associated with bad credit systems, bad input systems, bad poor quality seed that's been sold, etc., that resulted in farmers being put into high debts, high losses, etc. So there are various issues around all of this that are leading to the quote distress of farmers. And in my view, the way one addresses this is to look at how do you improve the connection of small farms to markets. That's where the big change has to come from. It's not keeping farmers as subsistence farmers, because no farmer wants to remain a subsistence farmer. They want to grow, they want to have better incomes, they want to have children in schools, they want to have children go into urban employment. And to the extent that we can look at farming communities as becoming more commercial, becoming more market oriented, the less you will see that distress issue coming.
That brings me to the question which Nitin has posted. Do you think that the recent farm bills, which the government of India sought to introduce, were a step in the right direction to address some of the issues that you just mentioned, like access to markets, contract systems, and all that? But there was a big furor, and government eventually had to withdraw the bills, in spite of friends like you, your friend Ashok Gulati and all, advocating that they are the right thing to do for the country. What are your views on these farm bills?
I think the bills per se were in the right direction. They were addressing some of the right problems. I think they were introduced poorly. I think one could have created a much more inclusive process for putting forward the bills, and a much more inclusive process for getting the farm community to be part of that change process. The way they were put forward created some of the issues that we've seen. And but I think the bills per se would have addressed many of the issues that I bring up today. I see.
Yeah, there's another question relating to this recent interest or focus on organic farming or natural farming. There's a question in the chat box. How do you see that playing into this whole situation of alleviating hunger around the world?
I think that organic farming, natural farming have a place, a role to play. There's a niche that they can be part of, especially in vegetable production. So if you look at if I go to my grocery store here in Ithaca, New York, there's a section where I can buy organic vegetables, and there's a section where it's non-organic, regular vegetables. And there's a price difference between them.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm willing to pay the price, I can buy the organic vegetables. And there's a market for that, and that's growing. And I see the same thing happening in India. But I would take very strong issue with people who think all of India can go natural farming, or all of India can go organic farming. There are 100 million farms in farm households in India. Can we imagine all farmers in India doing the same thing? There have to be different options, depending on the crop, depending on the markets, depending on demand situations. So I support organic agriculture as an option, and it has to be an option, but it can't be an exclusive solution for the entire country.
Right. Let me just bring up a question, which is there any other place in the world where this food producers organizations have actually worked? You referred to that as one of the steps that could be taken.
Farmer producer organization.
Yes. Have they worked in any other place in the world?
Yeah, in fact, there's a global review of that, of farmer producers organizations, that we just recently published. It's on our website. They work where the connection to a market is very clear. So even in India, if you look at tea producer organizations or coffee producer organizations or some of the export crop producer organizations, they have worked very well because there's a clear market, there's a clear value chain around it, and clear contractual arrangements around it. They haven't worked well for domestic markets as much. Mm-hmm. And that's been, I think that's the challenge. And part of the reason for that is all of the regulatory structures and institutional structures are not well established. And so for a group to be contracted to produce tomatoes for the market, that contractual arrangements are not as clear as for an export crop oriented producer organization. So, but you see similar issues around the world, but for high value crops, market oriented crops, these the organizations have worked quite well.
I see. There's an observation that in 2021, India ranked 101 out of 116 countries in the global hunger index. Apparently it slipped from the 90s to 101. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, why did it slip when we are doing so well in productivity, in the public distribution system? What could be the reasons for this?
So I give a whole lecture on why I don't think the Global Hunger Index is not the right measure.
I see.
So I won't go into a lot of detail. I'll just give you a 1 minute answer on that. The problem with the Global Hunger Index is the Global Hunger Index has 3 components to it. One common component is the number of hungry people. The second component is child mortality. And the third component is, I think, stunting, wasting, etc. So what the second 2 components are not calculated every year. The data comes every 5 years, every 10 years. The mortality numbers come with every census. So when you look at today's Global Hunger Index numbers, those 2 components data is 10 years old. The hunger numbers depend on the production in the last 3 years, but the distribution of food consumption distribution, the parameters for that distribution depend on the National Sample Survey data on food consumption by income groups. The last time India did a national sample survey was 2011-12. So the Global Hunger Index depends on the data that's available in the country. So India's food consumption distribution data is from 2011 and 12. Mortality data is from the census, which took place 10 years ago. And the child stunting data, which the current Global Hunger Index did not use the numbers that came from the most recent survey. So it's all a numbers game.
Right.
And I wouldn't use the Global Hunger Index. It's a nice publicity story, but it's a really terrible index to use.
I see. Yeah. I think we are coming close to 8 o'clock, so I'll probably take one question more or maybe couple. So the third generation farming entrepreneur, Mr. Satish Babu, has an interesting observation. He feels that malnutrition can be actually tied up to the drastic fall in cattle population, because cattle and soil are complementary to each other, and because humans cannot by themselves strengthen the soil nutrient. And we have Jaggi Vasudev running a global campaign on Save Soil right now out of India. So he feels that cattle play a vital role in addressing malnutrition of the humans. Any comments on that?
Oh, absolutely. Soil health in general is very important, and cattle manure plays a big role in that. But in general, I think looking at intercropping, bringing more nitrogen placement back in through crops such as pulses, etc., plays a big role. So cattle numbers are dropping, and that's true. And part of the reason cattle numbers are dropping is you don't use as many male cattle anymore for plowing and transport, etc. operations, because all of that has become more mechanized. And most of the cattle population is dairy type population that's left behind. And they're much more shed based rather than open grazing based. So that's going to lead to much of the change. But I think the way one would address that, in addition to looking at improved productivity of the animals per se, is also to look at ways in which you can change the nutrition status through changes in cropping systems and cropping practices and soil health practices, etc. There's a lot that can be done there that extension should be looking at.
There's also one school of thought which says cattle contribute a lot to the climate change, the ozone layer depletion. So in the Western countries especially, I think they are very conscious that shed-based cattle and the gases that they produce are also contributing to the climate change. So there is some hesitation on that.
Right,
okay.
And one of our new projects is looking at this issue of zero hunger, zero carbon, addressing carbon emissions and looking at livestock as one of the sources of emissions. But for India, it's a much more challenging issue because people have one or two animals rather than hundreds of animals within a farm.
Thank you, Prabhu. And it's 8 o'clock. So on behalf of the president and the executive committee, I'd like to thank you for spending the evening with us. But it has been fascinating to know so many aspects of agriculture and what goes behind, the technology, the science, and the kind of academic rigor that institutes like yours are contributing. Thank you very much. And I may now call upon our secretary, Mr. Subhash Chandra Bose, to
ask
the vote of thanks, please. Mr. Bose.
Professor Prabhu. Thank you, Subhash. Air Commodore Dr. Arora wants to say something.
Sorry?
Air Commodore Dr. Arora wants to say something.
Dr. Arora, can you unmute yourself? Yeah.
Professor Pingali, there is a very interesting fact. I'm working on that. Use of pesticide, insecticide, fungicide, and herbicide. India, it is gone beyond imagination. It is affecting the genetic system of human body. The iron deficiency anemia, which is in women in India, despite eating well, is one of the reasons. That's my subject, actually, I'm working on that. The malnutrition, the undernutrition among children is, all these chemicals are directly affecting the genetic system of the body. None of the world over people are speaking on these issues. You can see this GM food also doing the same thing. It is going around world over, but we don't want to speak about it. But that's, I was listing it out. There are 42 chemicals which are used as a pesticide, insecticide, herbicide in India. All are deadly poisonous materials on the crop. I was talking to, I went away to Panipat. My brother-in-law is a doctor. So one of the patients, he's a Kisan, he came to him. He gifted him some grains. He said, sir, ye khaiye, don't eat what you buy from market because that's a poison. And I am giving you without any adulteration with chemicals. So this is happening. I do not know world over it may be happening, but India, it is happening in a big way. We need to be aware. Almost all the diseases are attributed to these chemicals in a big way.
Thank you. Should I quickly respond to that?
Yeah.
No, I think you're absolutely right on the insecticide issue. And, many parts of the world have now managed to get out of the very dangerous chemicals and move to practices which require much, much lower levels of insecticide use. And it hasn't happened as much in India, partly because of the continued high levels of subsidy, but also because the extension hasn't paid enough attention to the alternatives. So I think there's an issue there. I just want to make one point on GM crops. Right now, the only GM crop in India is BT cotton. There's no other GM crop in India. So I don't think there's a GM crop issue here. It's very much an insecticide issue, and there are alternative ways of addressing productivity with much more reduced insecticide use. Back to you, Subha.
Yeah, we had an interesting talk on GM crops by Dr. Push Bhargava of CCMB. He unfortunately is no longer there now, he's passed on, but he dealt a lot on the GM crop issue. I think that was many years ago. Thank you. Bosgaru, would you like to propose the vote of thanks?
Thank you, Subbarao Garu. President of FOSWL Hyderabad, Sri Venkateswara Garu. Distinguished Speaker, Mr. Prabhu Pingali. Family and friends of Dr. Mullapudi Harischandra Prasad, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for joining our 163rd monthly meeting. This is the 7th monthly meeting in our 14th year without a break. We thank the family members of Dr. Mullapudi Harischandra Prasad Garu for establishing an annual endowment lecture in his name in the month of July. The logistics sponsorship of rupees 5,000 every year is open, and I invite you to support FOSWL by becoming a logistics supporter. Please write to the FOSWL email address and we will send you the needed details. Thank you, Mr. S.S. Prasad, for reading the prayer. Thank you, Mr. Gangaraju Gunnam, for introducing the distinguished speaker, your classmate from school. Your TV series Amrutam and movies like Little Soldier and Amma Cheppindi are ever popular with many of us. To most of us, the words famine and hunger are synonymous. We learned today that it is an incorrect understanding, and we are fortunate to have learned so much on the subject of hunger, malnutrition, natural farming, and what can be done to improve accessibility to adequate nutrition to people in every part of the world, especially in India. The kind of research work being done by Dr. Pingali and his colleagues augurs well for the world. We are also very proud and happy to see a person from our part of the country having accomplished so much in this field. We thank you, Dr. Prabhu, for spending the evening with us and for your time and effort to put together such an interesting and comprehensive presentation. We wish you more successes in your work to serve humanity in alleviating hunger. We propose to continue with these Zoom meetings till further notice. Please continue to follow COVID protocols as we are hearing of growing cases again and new variants being identified. Our forthcoming monthly meetings are as follows. Saturday, 20th August 2022, Mr. Varaprasad Reddy I. Konduru, founder and former managing director of Shanta Biotechnics, a pioneering biotechnology company, will deliver a talk on my life journey. Saturday, 17th September 2022, Mr. Girish Reddy, formerly with Goldman Sachs, on the boards of Cornell and ISB, will deliver a talk on global attraction of US universities. Saturday, 15th October 2022, we propose to have a talk on skin problems in the elderly. We are awaiting confirmation from the speaker. Good night, ladies and gentlemen, till we meet on the third Saturday of August, the 20th, for our 164th monthly meeting. Stay safe. Thank you all.
Thank you, Bosgaru. May I ask the class of 1971 ISC guys, just hang on for a little while. Seshu wanted us to stay on after the meeting. I think we are about 5 or 6, so just hang on for a minute. Thank you, the rest of us. Good night, and thank you for attending this meeting. Good night. Good night.